The current economic framework, which was predicated on the belief that lowering taxes, liberalization, financial market liberalization, trade liberalization, would lead to faster economic growth and to everybody's well-being increasing, we now realize that those ideas were wrong. I'm Joe Stiglitz. I teach at Columbia University. The world today is facing a confluence of several problems, many of which are interrelated, represent some real challenges that so far our political system has not been able to address effectively. Because the fruits of what limited economic growth were not widely shared, large fractions of the population have seen their income stagnate or even decline. A notion that globalization would itself lead to the growth of economies and everybody would be better off. Well, economic theory actually was much more qualified in its endorsement of free trade. For instance, I showed many years ago if trade liberalization could and would increase risk, the consequence of that was that everybody in all the countries could be worse off. What that says is before you liberalize, you ought to think about making sure your markets are working well, particularly in countries like the United States. Those who were pushing for liberalization at the same time opposed assistance that would have helped people make the adjustment. One of the most important contributions in our understanding of trade were a series of theorems by Paul Samuelson, which showed that in advanced countries, liberalization would lower the incomes of unskilled workers. No one, when they were pushing for trade liberalization, even mentioned this. Markets are not, in general, efficient. We've known that markets are neither efficient nor stable, and yet policymakers and many economists proceeded as if, quote, economics taught us that markets were always efficient and stable. I mean, if everybody's against it, why is it proceeding? Well, there's a very easy answer. It was a corporate agenda. It was an agenda that had the effect of lowering wages, driven mainly by the desire to increase profits. You see that vividly in, for instance, the intellectual property agenda, increased the profits of big pharma at the expense of access to life-saving medicines all over the world. We didn't provide the social protection that we should have provided. If we're going to really have sustained economic growth based on globalization, we need to rewrite the rules of globalization. We have to have a deeper reform in our economic system, a new social contract that ensures that growth is inclusive, that there is shared prosperity.
Hi, and welcome back to the Lighthouse. This will be our last stop before we finally head out into the questions fair, into the sky, where we have our opening session of the YSI questions fair. And the opening speak will be by Professor Joe Stiglitz. And I know that you're all really excited about this. So are we. We're even more excited about the fact that we will be starting with such an inspiring speaker. The questions fair is some custom-built software developed by our friends over at Entropy Fox. It is a completely new idea. We're doing it for the first time. It's an experiment. And we're very happy that you're joining us in this. We don't know how it's going to go. But the idea is that when we are here now in order to discuss the 100 most pertinent questions for YSI, we will do this with input from world-class speakers. So first, Joe Stiglitz is going to suggest some questions, and then all of us are going to come together to discuss Joe's questions as well as questions that we suggest ourselves. So if you're watching this on the live stream, or even if you're on Facebook Live or YouTube, and you want to be part of the questions fair, you have to head over into the plenary site now. Otherwise, you can't participate by suggesting, rephrasing, and taking advantage of all these tools. You should go to plenary.ysi.ineteconomics.org, and then you press the sky. You press the stars up in the right corner, and that's where you can find the globalization constellation where Joe is going to speak. yeah, when after Joe's talk, we discuss the questions. All these questions can be loaded up into the graph, and then we can use those to come closer to our set of 100 questions. As you head over there, I know that Mads is going to be the questions moderator of this session, and he will welcome you over in the globalization constellation. So we're going to head over there now, but first with a little rap introduction by Nathan Oglesby.
Localize or globalize, localize or globalize, localize or globalize, interwoven or broken lines, globalize or localize, globalize or localize, globalize or localize, the globe is wide, I don't know your lives, globalize or localize. Human beings are social. We gather to the center where the energy is focal. Let's share a Coca-Cola, give your selfhood to the total. But if everyone lives everywhere, then no one is at home though. Where you go depends on where you start. It's mega corporations and global markets. It's Darwinistic, it's are you fitter? The globe is big, but the market's bigger. How big's too big? How far's the chart of the growth extend? And when's it start to hold its stock but lose its heart? A unity that destroys its parts. Localize or globalize, localize or globalize, localize or globalize, interwoven or broken lines. Globalize or localize, globalize or localize, globalize or localize, or go for both with open eyes.
Welcome to the question session. My name is Mads Vestergaard, and I have the honor of moderate this very first question fair session. We are here to settle on the questions, to provide the right answers, to provide the right solutions to the problems or the challenges we are facing. We need to ask the right questions first of all. And this is what we have to do now. This is kind of a new format because we are used to going to conferences where we're trying to provide answers, come up with results and methods. But to focus specifically on the question is not totally an unknown situation to most of us. Think of this situation when a young scholar comes to a supervisor with a research question. Ask, is this a good research question for collaboration, for a PhD project, or whatever research the young scholar is going to conduct. And then you qualify that research question to make it an even better one, more inspiring, more pertinent. And this is why we are here. We need to make this into a question incubator. And this question incubator is also a way to produce a lot of questions that we can then support to see which questions are to be the 100 inspiring questions to guide our future research and collaboration. I will now make it an option to suggest new questions, so you can put in your questions, and you can also support others' questions by providing them with a like. And those questions who get the most like, the most support from the community, those will be presented to our speaker for comment as research questions. So don't hold back, give away, bring all your best questions you can, and then we'll take from there, get to the stars. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Rob and Heske, who are our session moderators for this session, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
And I'm thrilled to be here with you in the globalization constellation. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our speaker, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, as well as Rob Johnson, President of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I will now extend the floor to Rob, who will introduce our speaker. Joe, if I may call you that. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Heske. 39 years ago, I walked into a class called Advanced Theory at Princeton University. I'd already met Joe Stiglitz, but I had no idea what I was going to be in for. Joe had 4 students and himself. There were 5 of us in the classroom for an entire year. There wasn't a lot of structure. There wasn't a real intense reading list. Every day Joe came in and we talked about the themes he was interested in and then derived them together. This process went on, including some very enthusiastic conversations and walks afterwards. And when we got to the end of the year, we went into our general exam, and the 3 other gentlemen and myself, and it was 4 males at the time, we worked very hard together to prepare for the general exam. So little did I know when I walked in, sat down for the general exam and flipped over the page, what I would read. And what I read was, you have spent all these years learning about what other people did. You have looked at research, you've looked at methods, but the future of your career will be something different. It will be you creating ideas. It will be you doing things that others haven't done. So for the next 3 hours, why don't you get a head start and tell me the things that you haven't seen in the literature that you think should have been developed. And we were all kind of looking at each other like, wow, that really wrong-footed us. But there was a certain joy and enthusiasm in that. And when we walked out, I was standing next to a man who I believe is now a Princeton professor named Dilip Abru. And I said to him, Joe Stiglitz might say he teaches economics, but what he really teaches is camaraderie, curiosity, creativity, and courage. And that was, without question, the most powerfully motivating course that I took as an economist, whether undergraduate or in graduate school. So I think the spirit of Joe Stiglitz, which was evident in the way he shaped us, is some of the, what you might call the secret sauce to his creativity. And I'm glad he's here to share it with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for that really nice introduction. It was a wonderful class, and it was great that you were there. In the short time I have, I thought I'd talk about 3 topics, maybe a little bit ambitious, that 3 areas where questions are being posed that have not been answered, I think, or at least answered adequately. The first is a set of questions posed by the pandemic itself. A second is a set of questions posed by the digital economy, what's going on in the digital economy. And the third is, I'll call it just very briefly, the new international economic order. Each of these areas are areas where old thinking, whether it's based on neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, a lot of the old models, either has very little to say or what it has to say is wrong. So what I want to, wrong or misleading. So I think these are obviously exciting topics that are absorbing a lot of our energies, both in terms of economics and politics. So let me begin with the pandemic, which has been shaping our lives so much since the beginning of the year and will continue to shape our lives. In many ways, it's an unprecedented macroeconomic event. The decline in GDP, the loss of jobs, the pace at which that has occurred has never been seen before. And even now that there's been a bounce back, we're still way below where we were at the beginning of the year. And clearly it ranks within the top 2 or 3 economic downturns of a century. And so the natural question to ask is, how well did the tools that we have prepare us to respond? And the associated question is, how does thinking about this pandemic inspire new research? In many ways, like the 2008 financial crisis. As many of you know, it was that financial crisis that gave rise to the birth of INET. The sense was that the models that had been used were not up to the task. The models used by the central bankers and the prevalent models in macroeconomics not only hadn't forecast the occurrence of this, the most significant event since the Great Depression, the model said that kind of event couldn't happen. And it's been very interesting for me to watch how the defenders of those models, the models, say the DSGE models, have responded. Some of them, like Bernanke, said, oh, there was nothing wrong with the models. It was just the way we implemented them. Of course, he was responsible for implementing them as well as creating them. So there was some question about why the models weren't well implemented. And not, as I said when I was at the World Bank, if you have poorly designed models, they're not going to be able to be implemented. It was more than an implementation problem. Other creators of the DSGE model said, oh, the model was fine. It's just that this time there was, quote, a rollover crisis. Well, what is a rollover crisis? It was a liquidity crisis. It was an example of capital markets not clearing, financial markets not clearing. Exactly the kind of thing that many of us had said was missing from these models. They didn't have credit rationing. They didn't have liquidity crises. So in fact, as they try to invent a new name for the crisis, inventing a new name doesn't get you off the hook. The fact was their models were not up to the task of either predicting, explaining, or providing a prescription of what should be done. Well, the pandemic in some ways illustrates a similar series of problems with the existing model. And one of the aspects of the pandemic is that it has generated some exciting new research, including research using new technologies that I think will be influential in the future. In particular, the new research that is coming out has been using real-time data. Economists in the past have had always were, when we say we talk about forecasting last month's GDP. We talk about forecasting what has already happened. And that was because we don't get the data for weeks. And what we're trying to do is make decisions today based on data that we don't yet have. And we're forecasting the data that we are about to have about the past. Well, there's been some work over the last 10 years of scraping the internet to make forecasts. And now we've made another step forward that several of the companies that are engaged in daily transactions have provided that daily data to researchers that have enabled them to see what is going on in the pandemic on a daily basis. And that's really important because this disease has unfolded at a pace that is unlike any other. And so having a view of what is happening to the economy on a daily basis is really important. The policymakers haven't really incorporated this. I'll come back to that. It has to do with some dysfunction in American politics. But the researchers have done, I think, some very impressive work. Some of this, for instance, has exposed the disparities in our economy, disparities of which we were aware, but we've never seen it with this kind of microscope. We talk about two groups, say, of Americans. One group is living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck. That's about the bottom 50%. We had data that had said that the average checking account, savings account of an American is about $400, $500 for the bottom half. They just didn't have any reserves. On the other hand, the people at the top are awash with money. And that picture got heightened as the pandemic went on. What we saw is that the day the checks arrived, for those in the bottom, their spending went up. They were not able to buy food because they didn't have enough money. So the checks that were sent in the early spring were absolutely vital to their survival. On the other hand, for those at the top, we have a very different picture. And this is highlighted by some of the more traditional macroeconomic data, which showed in the second quarter, the savings rate of America as a whole, a savings rate that is normally around 3%, sometimes down to 0, sometimes up to 5%. The savings rate, the average savings rate of America hit over 25%. And if the bottom 50% is saving at 0 or negative, that means the upper half was saving well over 40%. It just highlights the different experiences of different Americans. And that highlights something that many of us talked about in the context of the 2008 crisis. The standard model in macroeconomics, which was based on the representative agent model, where everybody was identical, and ignoring these differences simply could not give us a good picture of what was going on in the macroeconomy. And so these results heighten the imperative of creating models where we incorporate distributional concerns. It also heightens another set of questions. I talked about the enormous increase in the savings rate of people at the top who are not living hand to mouth. We naturally call that precautionary savings. The notion of how people behave in moments of extreme uncertainty is one of the big issues that Keynes talked about. But economists, or mainstream economists, have largely swept that issue under the rug. And that's why the standard models that you see, the DSGE models, talk about a world in which there is rational expectations, no learning, a set of shocks with a well-defined objective distribution, shocks to technology, and there's common knowledge. Everybody agrees about that. Well, this is highlights that every one of those assumptions doesn't make any sense. There's no objective distribution that we could talk about for how the occurrence of the disease or how it will evolve. There's no common knowledge. There are large dispersions in beliefs. And that gives rise to a whole set of questions that one has to ask and are not addressed within that standard model. Let me just mention a few of those. First of all, the standard model involves what is called savage utility functions, well-defined expected utility. But when there is these extremes uncertainty, the standard axioms defining subjective expected utility don't hold. And individuals will want to have even more precautionary behavior that is more consistent with maintaining flexible responses to the unknown and unknowable. Krebs at Stanford has put forward a theory of flexibility, which contrasts to the standard theory of subjective utility. And so it highlights that as an important area of economic research. It heightens another aspect. Because there's not common knowledge, people will differ about the probabilities of events. And the standard models say that when there are differences in probability of events, people will engage in bets implicitly or explicitly about that. Those bets will increase expected utility, but those bets can increase volatility. It's what Martin Guzman and I have called pseudo-wealth. And the increase and decrease in disparities of beliefs give rise to variations in pseudo-wealth, and those variations in pseudo-wealth therefore give rise to variations in aggregate economic activity. And again, it's something totally excluded from the standard model. The third aspect, which is related to that, which is that in general, because people engage in these kinds of bets, they believe that they're going to win. And that means the total value of pseudo-wealth exceeds the true wealth of the economy. And that means people's plans have to be disappointed. Their plans in the aggregate exceed the resource constraints. It is inevitable. And it is inevitable in any market with any economy with incomplete markets. So that in turn means that there will be moments of crises where people's plans can't be fulfilled. And when that happens, it can be a moment of great disturbance, but also great learning, because people then have to reassess their beliefs about the economy. A fourth example where the pandemic illustrates the kinds of ideas that INET has emphasized. I had a task force focusing on macroeconomic externalities, how what happens in one sector has spillovers to others. In this case, the pandemic has affected some sectors, like the restaurant sectors, much more than others. But downturns in one major part of the economy can lead, as it did in the Great Depression, to constraints, unemployment in other sectors of the economy. Finally, a question that the pandemic is raising is, it is clearly accelerating the process of digitalization, of robotization. Robots don't come down with COVID-19. And so what we now realize is that there is a risk of human labor that isn't confronted by machine labor. And that changes the balance between human labor and machine labor. And that may accelerate the process of robotization of the economy, accelerating the trends for unemployment among unskilled workers, and accelerating the inequalities in our system. In other words, accelerating some of the structural transformations already going on. So these are just some of the questions that the pandemic has raised. These, in turn, brings me to the second topic, the digital economy. I've already raised a number of questions about that, but there are two others that I want to just very briefly talk about. Many of you may know that my work for which I got the Nobel Prize was about the economics of information, and it was about asymmetries of information. It was based on the idea that some people know things that others don't, and they can't be forced to disclose that, or they may not be, and a question about how markets induce disclosure. But what has happened in the last 10 years has made us aware that there are problems, not just of asymmetries of information, but disinformation, misinformation, incentives that people have to lie. And of course, we have mechanisms to deal with that. When I say mechanisms, we have things like fraud laws, libel laws, but the point is that we are always balancing those with basic rights of free speech. And we are now in a world where that balancing may have to be done in a different way. And we may have to think more deeply about how we curtail deliberate efforts at lying, disinformation, misinformation. At the same time, we are facing an unprecedented increase in market power by the digital giants. And an era a little bit like that at the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th century, where there's enormous concentration of market power with political consequences, economic consequences. But then we had a clear remedy: break them up. That remedy may not be as appropriate, and the dimensions of abuse of market power are much richer, including political manipulation that we've just seen. So to me, one of the big challenges that we confront today is exactly constructing the appropriate, you might call, regulatory framework for the digital era. The final comment is the new international order. A lot been made about how Trump has undermined the rules-based international economic order, how he's abrogated agreements, undermined the WTO. The list goes on. What is very clear, we now realize that borders matter. And in many ways, this election has changed the international landscape in a fundamental way, because up until this election, people could write off 2016 as an aberration. But with the election in 2020, with Trump getting as many votes as he did, even though he lost the election, those outside the United States will have to worry, is there a possibility of another election where another demagogue, another nativist, another protectionist gets elected? And America will be viewed as an unreliable partner. And that raises a whole set of issues. In the aftermath of the fall of the Iron Curtain, Fukuyama raised the idea that we were, at the end of history, we were all converging to liberal democracies and free market economies. At this point, this seems like a Pollyannish fantasy. We are not converging. And we know neoliberalism does not provide an economic framework that even the West can agree with. But it's very clear that even if it were a framework, it's not a framework that the entire world can agree on. So that means, that raises the question, how do we develop an economic order in which we can cooperate with countries whose values we may differ fundamentally with, and whose economic system is fundamentally different? We have to cooperate for climate change. We have to cooperate for dealing with pandemics. But that doesn't mean that we walk away from our commitments to democracy and human rights. So the question is, how do we balance? How do we get the gains from trade? How do we get the gains that we need from global cooperation in dealing with the global problems, and yet maintain our commitment to and advocacy of these basic values to which we are committed? So that frames the international agenda going forward in a very different way than it was framed in the era of neoliberalism, where it was just let's get rid of all subsidies, let's get rid of all barriers, and let free markets prevail, in the belief that eventually everybody would be better off. We now know that trickle-down economics doesn't work. We should have known it then. We have theorems that told us it wouldn't work. We should have known that we needed to make sure, take government intervention to make sure that everyone benefited. We didn't. We now are living with some of the consequences of that. But now the agenda, as neoliberalism has been discredited, the agenda becomes much more complicated as we live in a much more divided world, and one where we do not appear to be having convergence to liberal democracies or even well-managed market economies.
Thank you, Joe. What a wonderful address here to kick us off in the questions fair. You've really laid out the landscape, almost the perfect storm of challenges that we are facing today, not just the pandemic, but the digitalization of our world and the changing landscape that is really progressing in real time as we converse. So thank you so much for setting the stage here. As you know, YSI has set itself the challenge to determine the 100 most pertinent questions for young scholars to focus their work on moving forward. And I'm grateful to you already for raising so many terrific questions in your talk itself. I'm sure that you've inspired the young scholars who are listening to your address to also come up with more questions themselves that they would like to bring into consideration for additions to the graph. The graph, as viewers can now see on the screen, is already evolving. Questions have been added already, and I'm going to bring the first question from a young scholar in the audience to Joe for comments on whether this question is one of pertinence, one that young scholars should dedicate their time and attention to, or one that we might need to tease out a little bit, reframe. So let me read question number one. Question number one is, to what extent is the discipline of economics a part of the problem itself?
Well, the discipline, let me put that in two different ways. I think the question is, at the broadest level, the discipline of economics is about resources being constrained. Now, we talk about economics as the science of scarcity. So at that level, scarcity has not disappeared. And understanding the implications of scarcity is still one of the major issues we have to face. The problem is how you frame the issue of scarcity. So, for instance, until not that long ago, the planetary boundaries were not talked about. That is part of the scarcity. We have to live within our planetary boundaries. And the fact that the economics profession ignored the planetary boundaries was part of the problem. And so, and how many elementary economics courses did they begin by saying the most important constraint we have is that we have to live within the planetary boundaries? Now, almost no basic textbook begins in that way. So that's an example where the economics profession, I think, went wrong. The second thing is where it went wrong is in another important scarcity is time. And we don't, the way time is talked about is we divide life into work and leisure. And when you're not working in the market economy, you're enjoying leisure. Well, there's a lot of work that goes on outside the market and within the home. And there's a lot of inequality in the allocation of that time. One of the things that gender studies has exposed is the inequalities associated with the production in production in the home. And so while economists talk about just one part of the production system, the market, there's another part of the production system that reflects more broad societal inequalities. A third example of where the market goes wrong, I always illustrate by the model of Robinson Crusoe. If you study graduate advanced economics, you will have used the Robinson Crusoe model. And that's about how individuals allocate consumption between today and tomorrow, or they're solving their resource allocation problem. It's described as Robinson Crusoe. I've always had two problems with that. The first is economics is a social science. It's about people interacting with other people. Robinson Crusoe is an individual living alone. It's not a social science. So the fact that the model that economists often begin by illustrating the economy is a model which is not a model of social science, illustrates that how badly off economics has been, how misguided it's been. But those of you who remember, and I read when you were kids, Daniel Defoe's book on Robinson Crusoe, will remember that there was actually on that deserted island somebody else besides Robinson Crusoe. Something was called his man Friday. Well, that illustrates a power relationship. And it was a power relationship that was very interesting. Friday actually was the one who knew how to do everything. He was the one who should have been making the decisions. But they had inherited a relationship, a social relationship, from a discriminatory social relationship, a power relationship from the UK, which was perverse in terms of where the real knowledge base was. And that tells us so much about the nature of our society. So I think if we had actually talked more about the real book of the deserted island with Friday and the relationship between Friday and Robinson Crusoe, we might have had more insight into society than the economist studying Robinson Crusoe. And finally, one of the things that my own research in recent years has focused on is the endogeneity of preferences. The economics model always begins with preferences as well defined. But our economic, social, political system shapes who we are. It may have shaped us to be extraordinarily materialistic. There are large differences in preferences between Europe and the United States that were not there 50 years ago. How did that come about? Those are the kinds of questions I think that we need to be asking, and the interaction between broadly society and the economy, our shaping of our preferences, that is at least a key issue that we have to deal with.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Joe. Rob, I would invite you to also comment on this question if you'd like to. I can reframe the question or rephrase the question just for a moment as a recap. Our audience member suggested we add the question, to what extent is the discipline of economics a part of the problem itself? Rob.
Well, I think Joe did a very nice job of discussing many of what you might call the misspecifications. These are not scientifically derived. They are what you might call social customs, tribal customs. His co-holder of the Nobel Prize from 2001, George Akerlof, has been working very much in relation to what we might call consumer theory and the structure of demand by working on what he calls identity economics, where the psychology of the interaction between people and the, well, I'll say not frozenness, the suppleness and the dynamism of what we call preferences kind of contradicts the notion that the model of the market is one that aggregates the desires of all people. What René Girard, a famous literary writer, called mimetic desire is another pathway. And I think that where economics is perhaps circled the wagons too tightly is not exploring this more textured psychological model. But there are many interfaces of interdisciplinarity. And I think in my own criticism of the economics profession, not to the person, but there tends to be a bit of a huddle to purify the brand so that it can be a reliable consultant to wealthy and powerful interests. And it's people like Joe Stiglitz. Remember, I talked about the 4 C's of creativity, courage, camaraderie, which was part of what he engendered in a classroom. I think, how would I say this? You get a lot of pressure in the economics profession from the peer review journals, from the tenure process. And you have to be extremely brilliant to be able to break away and inspire people when your creativity frightens people. Joe's a person that could achieve that. George Ekerlof has achieved that. But I think that the profession needs to be a little less guarded at a time like the pandemic unmasking, when the fault lines and the flaws have been deeply revealed.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to bring to you the second question that our young scholars have suggested we take into consideration for our list of 100 questions. Let me read it for you. Question 2. To what extent can we model different types of uncertainty, such as the health-related, climate-related, and other related uncertainties?
Well,
Joe.
I think we can and we have to model this uncertainty. We recognize that we don't know exactly how the pandemic is going to evolve, and we can't know exactly how climate change is going to evolve. And our analysis has to deal with these uncertainties. And that relates to some of the things I said, some of the critiques I've had of, you might say, the standard models in economics. So I mentioned before that the macro models involved well-defined probability distributions of exogenously given technology shocks. Basically, in a technical sense, stationary stochastic processes. And the fact is, climate change cannot be well described as a stationary stochastic process. We don't know, we don't have the information to know exactly how it's going to evolve. We know an awful lot. Let me make it clear. It's not like we don't know that we are facing it, but we don't know the precision that you would need to make those models applicable. And the failure to deal with uncertainty is one of the reasons why the integrated assessment models, as used by, for instance, Nordhaus, are so badly flawed and lead to results that are, I would say, dangerous, because they talk about, oh, it's okay, the optimal intervention would allow us to, should entail us to have 3.5 degrees or more centigrade increase in the average temperature. A more reasonable model would take into account what we don't know. It would take into account what Marty Weitzman emphasized, the fat tails of the distributions. It would take into account what Ken Arrow and I did way back in the work that we did on the IPCC second assessment back in 1994-5, 3 to 5, where we talked about the correlations between the adverse events in climate change and our ability, and our, you might call it margin utility consumption, our ability to respond to those crises. There are a host of, I was going to use the word subtlety, but these are not subtleties. These are first order things that should have been brought into the analysis of the integrated assessment models, were not, could have been done, makes you ask the question, was there an agenda there that they decided not to include them? You know, after all, one of the things, once you go to a computer-generated model, you can incorporate much greater complexity than the kinds of things that those of us who have to use paper and pencil in a more theoretical model. So it could have been done. Admittedly, fat tail distributions raise deep problems where even expected utility may not be well defined. And that in turn relates to a broader sense of issues that I hinted at a minute ago on how people behave in the context of extreme uncertainty. The difference I alluded to the difference between expected utility using savage axioms and those of David Krepp's emphasis on the value of flexibility. It's just examples of directions of research. These are attempts to formalize what was, I believe, a central part of Keynes' analysis of the Great Depression. I was just on a Zoom yesterday with Skidelsky, who is one of the great biographer of Keynes, and emphasizes, of course, the stress that Keynes put on uncertainty, which has largely been ignored in the subsequent development of macroeconomics. But now, with the pandemic, we are beginning to realize that even the frameworks we had been using for dealing with uncertainty, the expected utility framework, may not be up to the task, and we will have to use more general frameworks for beginning to think about behavior with these very extremes of uncertainty.
Right. Thank you, Joe. I would love to bring you more questions from our audience members. I believe the suggestions keep coming, but I also know our time is limited. So I'm going to ask you instead, if from the many questions that you raised in your talk today, there is one question that you could phrase for us right now that we could add to the graph as of this moment, so that we have your one question of choice reflected among the stars. Is that something you could help me with before we end?
Well, I suppose the one area that I haven't talked about, which is absolutely at the center of what is going on, are how do we understand the innovative process? We
Beautiful.
are innovating, responding to the pandemic. We're innovating, responding to the financial crisis. When I say innovation, I mean both technology, but also social organization. We discovered that securitization wasn't quite the innovation that we thought. It had some dangers. So both social innovation, but also technological innovation. We need to think about how it is steered by the market and how we as a society ought to steer it.
Fantastic.
It is clear, and I've written about this, that the market on its own may not steer innovation the right way. We should have been allocating more resources to save the planet. Instead, we allocated resources to create more unskilled unemployment. Why would a rational society spend scarce resources, and remember economics is about scarce resources, why would it spend scarce resources increasing unskilled unemployment rather than protecting the planet? Well, the fact that it's doing what it's doing is evidence by itself that the market's not efficient. And understanding why that is the case and what we can do about it seems to me one of the goals, should be one of the objectives of research, one of the questions that we ought to be asking going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Rob, any closing thoughts from you before I wrap?
No, I just once again enjoyed being in Joe's class, just like I did in 1981. His vividness of imagination and curiosity is very striking and a great example for the young scholars. The one thing that I would have added perhaps was on the question of the ergodic instability, is that the financial sector has been a con artist by pretending that with its value at risk and bell curves based on financial asset prices, that they could keep what you might call their balance sheets and under control. And yet we all know that when the financial sector gets in trouble, it spills over and utilizes the fiscal capacity of society. And I think society has to call their bluff, put bigger, what you might call cushions and capitalization, because the real consequence is not just the fiscal capacity, it's the loss in the faith and integrity of expertise and governance, which has blossomed since the time of that crisis, and a repair where the people who were bailed out, as Joe Stiglitz famously said, the polluters are the ones that got paid. And those corruptions and those false, how would I say, assertions of control and stability were very, very damaging to the trust and faith in our societies, in the advanced countries, and that has ramifications for the whole world.
Can I add just one more thing to what Rob just said, which is that, and try to bring together a couple of things we've talked about. One of the big concerns is the consequence of climate change to the financial system. There are a lot of potentially stranded assets out there, oil companies, coal companies, and if the value of those should plummet, as they will at some point, it would have imposed risks on our global financial system. And who is going to pick up the tab for that? Actually, the financial market is once again showing itself to be short-sighted. And can we make a commitment that those engaging in those risky activities should bear the cost, not the rest of us?
Beautiful closing remarks, Joe. Thank you for wrapping it up like that. I, for one, have been feverishly writing all the questions that have been raised in these inputs, and I'm so grateful that you are here with us today. You really set the stage for us as we embark on this journey. And thank you to the young scholars at home who are in the constellation of globalization with us, who are bringing questions to the table. If you have instead been watching and you're not yet in the constellation, don't be shy. There is still time to join us there now. After we say goodbye to Professor Stiglitz and to Rob Johnson, we will continue the conversation there. So you can still join in. Go to ysiplenary.org and find the globalization constellation to join us directly in the Zoom. So you can bring your own questions into the conversation. Well, for now, thank you so much, Joe, for being with us. We truly appreciate it. Rob, thank you for joining. And we hope to continue the conversation much beyond.
Bye.
Thank you. And that's a wrap. Oh my God.
Really, maybe two great questions came in and tried to destroy the whole system, but that has been taken care of by the development team who was fixing this while we were doing it. But I want to apologize that some of you did not have the opportunity to suggest new questions when you wanted to. Fortunately, we did get a lot of great questions, and some of them though might seem to be more fitting in another constellation. And for this, I want to say, and I want to really to suggest all of you that think about those questions that you phrased that might not come from this session to the question graph, to put them in another relevant constellation talk or in some of the questions fair meetings that will be in the end of the week, where we really go into questions without input talk and only look at producing, finding questions. So you will have a chance to rephrase, to come up with these questions again in another context. But for now, let's look into the questions that received the most like, the most community support during the talk of Professor Stiglitz. And these questions are: to what extent is the discipline of economics a part of the problem itself? And the next one we made it to this field was: to what extent can we model different types of uncertainty, such as health-related, climate change, etc.? And these were the two questions that we had the time for posing for Professor Stiglitz for comments. And these would be the two questions which we now collaboratively work on rephrasing into the best of all possible research questions for guiding our future research and collaboration. So let's take it one by one. I mean, yeah, we have two, so we have a little time for each of them. Let's start out with the hit according to likes and submitted question, which goes: to what extent is the discipline of economics a part of the problem itself? I now allow new phrasings, so you should be able to suggest new phrasings for this question. If you're not, tell us right away in the chat, because then we'll have to sort this as we go. But you should be able to suggest a new phrasing if everything works as it should. And can we come up with a better phrasing of this basic question, and to what extent the discipline of economics is a part of the problem instead of the part of the solution, I suppose, is the point. Yeah, so let's take a little time, look into some rephrasings of that question. Oh, I'm getting a question whether in this chat. No, and sorry, I forgot to say that before. It's okay to be asked to unmute now, so we can also, now the talk is over, and you know, when the talk is on, the speaker talk is on, everybody's quiet, but now the talk is over, and we can open the floor for discussion. Also in this Zoom call, if you want to suggest a new phrasing or motivate a suggestion for a new phrasing that you have already made, then yeah, make a mark and take the floor. And if you cannot unmute yourself, ask for be on mute, and our Zoom moderator will control that part. All right, I see Adam.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Great. It was a really nice session. And towards the end, Stiglitz mentioned the role of the innovation could be rethought. And I think that the role of the discipline of economics also might have been innovated. According to Schumpeter, there are three types of the innovation, and the third one is invention, the second is innovation, the third is diffusion. I think that the diffusion part is which could be discussed here and regarding this question. And I think that this kind of plenaries might have been a good role models how to make diffusion of the role of economists, and I mean the discipline of economics. That was my concept of rephrasing. Thank you.
Thank you. This is interesting. Can we try to get this into writing? I mean, can we try to rephrase this, get the Schumpeter innovation point into this? Because I see the people are supporting the strain of thought. Let's get some Schumpeter into this. I think that's a nice idea. Not that my opinion matters. I'm just a moderator. I see we have a comment in the chat that I wanna read aloud. I would like to hear some opinions on the description of economics itself, of maximization under scarcity. I remember a few years ago there was quite some debate about this. Is maybe the definition of what economics is also in the contested field? Okay, we have some rephrasing suggestions. Besides the original one, we now have what parts of economics do not serve us anymore in this globalized world. We also have what is the purpose of economics. And then we have to what extent should economics as a discipline be rebuilt in order to address contemporary challenges. We have how can economics better respond to new challenges? And then we have which way of doing economics makes it into a part of its problem itself. The first formulation, which also have the incompetent advances, it has all the likes from the beginning. You have to remove your likes into another phrasing if you think that phrasing is better than the original, because the original has the incompetent advances from the beginning, and it's also is now being there with 15 likes. So it's on a definite winning path. All right, people can of course keep on moving their likes if they please in the first bundle of rephrasing of the first question about the economics being a part of the problem itself. But we can still also move on to the next question and to see if this can be rephrased in a novel way, making it even more inspiring and pertinent in the situation we are at. To what extent can we model different types of uncertainty, such as health-related, climate-related, etc. And I just public highlighted it, so it should be more visible in the graph. All right. Now for the last remaining minutes of this session, while we come up with rephrasing suggestions and move around our support in form of the heart likes, I will also open up for the last field, the galaxy, you could almost say. I'm gonna allow for favorites now. And if you see when the question list, now to the right of the question, a little star has emerged in the opposite side of the heart. And the stars and the hearts are different, because the hearts, that's when you're supporting questions inside a session. These are the questions of this session that we would like to get on to the speaker for comment, that we would like to get submitted to the whole galaxy, the whole question graph. But the stars, that's the way you make your favorites. And making your favorites is not local to each session, to each constellation. No, the stars are global or even galactic, you could say, because the stars are about which favorite questions you pick as your favorite questions for the whole plenary, from the whole galaxy, including all constellations. And these are those top 100 questions being made favorites, being made to your stars, are the ones that will be aggregated into the 100 questions ending off this plenary with, that will guide our future collaboration and future research in meeting up, facing the challenges that we are facing in this historical situation. So you can now favorite some questions, if some of the questions you see here are to be one of your favorites, but I also have to add that you only have a limited amount of favorites to pass around. There's a principle of scarcity here. So when you have put 10 stars, then you'll be asked to remove other stars to place new ones if better questions emerges during the plenary. And yeah. One detail about the stars and the favorites is that those will also be on display on your YSI profile. So your favorite question will be connected to your YSI profile at the membership platform as such. This may also be a pave a way for future research, for future collaborations between members and participants. So choose your favorites, but choose them wisely. But of course, you can change them later on during the plenary, and also doing some of the later sessions where to providing your favorites and to suggest new questions without having input talks is the essence of the sessions. But you still have the opportunity to end each input session like this one with providing your favorites by applying the star. All right, now time is up, and I want to thank you everybody very much for being a part of this first question fair session, and I hope you can excuse us for our stumbling and technical issues in this first run. But now we are setting our course towards the stars, and I'm looking forward to see all of you again at a later session. Thank you so much.